So, as you guys will also learn, as I talked about in the intro, we do something that's sort of like a grand season preview, and we're gonna start that today on this first podcast, on this first edition of the podcast. And it's not necessarily predictions, right? I'm not gonna go through and say, Oregon's gonna win. Well, I will do like a best case, worst case, and what's most reasonable. I'm not going to go through the entire schedule of Oregon and say, oh, yeah, they're going to lose to, I don't know, UCLA or Oregon State, or heck, they play Boise State, I think, early in the year. I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to go through my thoughts on the team. I'll give you my best case, worst case, and most reasonable. And also kind of give my thoughts on Dan Lanning. That's kind of a program no one talks about. There's other shows that will frankly just go over, the low-hanging fruit teams like Alabama, Colorado now with Deion Sanders. And I no hate Deion Sanders, but there are other teams out there like Iowa State, like Indiana, like Maryland. As a college football sicko, I care about those teams. I care about them. So I know you guys do too, even though it isn't necessarily going to bring in the most traffic, but it's kind of important to talk about those teams, like a Maryland, like a Purdue, like an Illinois, like a Mississippi State. But we're not talking about those teams. We're talking about Oregon. So Oregon, Dan Lanning, first year in the Big 12. Lanning's been there for about 3 years. 22-5 record as a head coach. Very, very good. Elite recruiter. Done that since he was at Georgia under Kirby Smart. What does this team look like? Well, I think there's a lot of question about the quarterback situation in the offense. Will Stein, second year, he had Bo Nix last year, Heisman Trophy candidate, great college quarterback, I know. There's a lot of knock from certain people who don't think Bo Nix is going to do well in the NFL. That's a totally different situation. I don't care about that right now. He was a good college quarterback. And that's a big shoe to fill for the incoming transfer, who is Dillon Gabriel via Oklahoma. And before that, he was at UCF under Josh Heupel. And I think Gus Malzahn, too. I think he may have been there as Malzahn's first year there. But he's the big name in the portal. He's going to be your starter. What does that look like? Well, I think for Gabriel, he's a dual threat guy, right? Dual threat guy. I think he's a lefty, too, I believe. So very different from what you saw from Bo Nix. But, Bo Nix is definitely, a different type of quarterback, obviously. Very much so in that, Baker Mayfield style. I think from Gabriel, you're definitely going to see not necessarily the same amount of numbers, but it's not going to be a drop-off. I don't think it's going to be like a significant drop-off, like going from like Jameis Winston to Sean McGuire, at Florida State. Not that type of drop-off. I think it's going to be while it's not going to be a totally smooth transition, but it's going to be an okay transition, I think. I think they'll be fine. They have weapons. Evan Stewart from A&M transferred. He was the number one receiver, I believe, in the portal. He goes to Oregon. They also got Dante Moore from the portal, from a former fellow Pac-12 team who is now a fellow Big Ten team. Dante Moore, not necessarily going to start this year. You may see him a little bit, but he's not really going to. He's not going to be the starter. Dillon Gabriel's the starter. So I feel pretty confident in that. I look at their schedule and. Non-conference, they get Boise State at home. It's on Peacock of all places. So if you want to watch it, then you have to buy Peacock. They play at Oregon State at week 3. Interesting game, rivalry game. Glad that those two were able to keep that rivalry intact, at least for a little bit. So that's good. At least from a college football traditional standpoint, that's good. Same with who's the other one? It's not Oklahoma State. They're not playing. I think it's Washington State, I believe. Yeah, but yeah, it was Washington State. So kudos to Washington and Oregon, despite the fact that they're not in the same conference as both their rival schools. And kudos to them to keeping that rivalry alive. But they played them week 3. It's gonna be strange to see them playing a little bit early in the year, but. It's whatever. I'm at least glad the game's being played. Ditto with Washington State. So that's our non-conference. And also get Idaho. So they play them. First game of the year. First Big Ten team that is a traditional team is Michigan State. And that's actually a week game. It's on a Friday on Fox. Interesting, Jonathan Smith new head coach there at Michigan State. Pretty familiar with Dan Lanning, so that's that he's no stranger to Oregon, so that should be interesting to see. Just the fact that it's Michigan State versus Oregon, it's a conference game. This is weird. They do play, technically their first Big Ten game is UCLA, but they've played UCLA multiple years. That's not a new opponent. But then comes October 12th, Ohio State comes to town. I think this could be the biggest game in the Big Ten this year, I think. And that's weird saying that because Oregon's a new team. But you go to the betting odds, and I believe it's Oregon, I think, is the number 2. Ohio State's clearly number 1. They got a good team. We'll do them eventually in this, the grand season preview series. But that game, October 12th, I think that's probably going to be the biggest game of the year in the Big Ten because we could see that matchup again because, every single major conference in America is no longer doing divisions. So you're taking only the 2 best teams record-wise. So which is why you could potentially see them play each other again and potentially see each other yet again in the playoffs. So, that's one of the sort of detractions, if you will, of the playoff is the potential to see teams play each other 3 times, most likely 2, but because these teams could face each other again in the conference championship game, they could see each other 3 times. So that's probably the biggest game in the Big Ten, I think, this year. They also go to Michigan, which is up there as well, but I think Michigan will get to them eventually. I think that's definitely a losable game. It's on the road. It's in November. It could be cold. Oregon's not really used to playing that. It's different to play in the cold in the Pacific Northwest and like Oregon, Washington, that part of the world. It's a little different, I think, than going to like Michigan in November where it could be snowing, could be raining, could be really windy, like that Northwestern Ohio State game back in 2022 where it was the final score was like 21-3, really windy, cold, and miserable. Certainly Oregon's not necessarily used to playing that weather, but I think they should be ready. In the back half of the schedule is Michigan, Maryland, Wisconsin, and Washington in the season, the final 4 games. Based on that schedule, and based on how much I trust Dan Lanning and how much I have faith in Dillon Gabriel as a starter, I think this team, best case, is 11-1. And I think that's pretty generous because I think certainly the Ohio State game is clearly the game I think they could lose. But I don't think a lot of folks are realizing that Michigan game, they could lose that game. And I don't have, spoiler alert, I don't think highly of Michigan this year. I think they're definitely sort of, I don't think they're going to be like a national title contender, but judging by the schedule, it's on the road. It's sandwiched in between, a game against Illinois, a game against Maryland, 2 reasonably, teams that you would see yourself as an Oregon fan better than as a new member of the conference. Michigan game, it's interesting. That's an interesting spot in the schedule, no less. So I think the best case for Oregon is, I think 11-1. I think that's the best case. Worst case, I think 9-3. I think there's a scenario where they could lose to UCLA. They could lose, well, maybe not them, but they could lose like a Washington, Wisconsin, and play them actually before Washington. Some of the road games, Ohio State clearly is the, lights and sirens. That's probably the most losable game on the schedule, or most likely to lose. I think 9-3 is probably would be the worst case scenario, which is good for most teams. Like if, Indiana win 9-3, that'd be the best season in Indiana history, I think. But most likely, if I had to lean to what I would pick, I think 10-2 is probably most likely. I think there's some games on that schedule that do worry me. The Michigan game is one. Ohio State clearly. Wisconsin to a certain degree. We'll see what the Tyler Van Dyke experiment up there looks like. I think there's a scenario where, Ohio State could beat Oregon. They could lose, but they could lose at Purdue. That game is on is also during the week. Is that on a Friday too? Yeah, it is a Friday. On the road. It's after a game against Ohio State. Interesting. But yeah, 10-2 for Oregon, first year in the Big Ten. Probably the most likely scenario for them. Again, I don't think it's necessarily going to be, the first year they go 6-6. Like if that happens, they go worse than 9-3. There's probably either a massive injury situation for Oregon, or just things just don't work out. You know, Dylan Gabriel experiment doesn't go well. They have to start Dante Moore, and he's still young, he's still a little green, and maybe there's, you know, some issues on defense, but I don't see that. I really think this team, from what Lanning has done recruiting-wise and through the portal, I think this team is probably disaster-proof, where I don't think a 6-6, 5-7, even, you know, 8-4 record, I don't see that happening. Now, it could happen. There's always a scenario it could. Like I just mentioned, the injury is a big part of that. Let's just say, you know, Evan Stewart gets injured. They have to start more freshmen. I know they got that really good receiver in this past class. But I don't really see this team being like disaster scenario, like A&M a couple years ago, you know, when they lost to Appalachian State. They go 5-7, really bad. I don't really see it. Unless, you know, like I said, you know, unforeseen circumstances happen, you know, injuries happen, the schedule, let's just say, I don't know, UCLA is actually a little better than we thought. Oregon State certainly could be an issue. It's a rivalry game. It's early. It's on the road. You know, could Maryland surprise some people? Could Purdue derail them? Because that's, you know, I think that's a game after Ohio State, and it's a short week. That's interesting. So, yeah, 10-2 for Oregon. Most likely scenario, most likely or most reasonable, I think, record-wise. I have a lot of faith in Dan Lanning. Dan Lanning's a really good coach.